Anurika grew up in a small, impoverished village where dreams of prosperity seemed out of reach. Her family's daily life was a cycle of hard labor and unfulfilled promises, yet they held on to hope. Anurika, with her striking beauty and intelligence, was often told she was destined for greater things. Her decision to move to Owerri was not just about ambition. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite her family's story. But the city was not as welcoming as she had imagined. The hustle, the noise, and the constant rejection wore her down, pushing her to the brink of despair. Little did she know, her journey to escape poverty would lead her into the depths of moral conflict and self-destruction. Her story was not just about survival. It was about the choices we make, the paths we take, and the shadows that follow us. The road to Owerri was both physically and emotionally exhausting. Anurika sat quietly in a cramped bus, clutching a small bag of belongings. Her mother's tearful goodbye replayed in her mind as she stared out the window. "Stay safe," her mother had whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't forget where you come from, and never let desperation cloud your judgment." Anurika had promised, but as the miles stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder if she was chasing a dream too big to grasp. The city skyline came into view, a glittering promise of opportunity that belied the struggles hidden within its bustling streets. As the bus pulled into Owerri's dusty terminal, Anurika inhaled deeply, trying to push aside the gnawing anxiety in her chest. The city felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had arrived in Owerri with nothing but hope and a desire to provide a better life for her family. The hustle and bustle of the city was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Tall buildings towered over narrow streets, and the streets themselves were teeming with people in a constant rush. Vendors called out to pedestrians, selling everything from fresh fruits to secondhand clothes. The cacophony of car horns, chatter, and music made it difficult to hear herself think. Anurika stepped off the bus and into the crowd, her heart pounding as she clutched the last remnants of her savings. She had no relatives here, no friends to turn to, and no one to rely on except herself. The thought of returning home in failure was too unbearable to consider, so she pushed herself forward, determined to make something of herself. The first few days in Owerri were harder than Anurika could have ever imagined. She scoured the city for legitimate work, visiting offices, handing out her resume, and speaking to anyone who would listen. But every door seemed to close in her face. The jobs available were low-paying, with no promise of upward mobility. Every lead she followed led to dead ends, and the desperation that had driven her to the city only grew with each rejection. The weight of her family's expectations pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her younger siblings depended on her success. Her mother, too, had placed all her hopes on Anurika's ability to make it in the city. With time running out and no financial stability in sight, Anurika's resolve began to falter. She had come to the city with nothing but dreams, but now she was starting to feel like they were slipping away. It was late one evening when she found herself sitting on a bench at a park, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling defeated and lost. That's when she met a woman named Ijeoma. Ijeoma was older, with a sharp gaze and a knowing smile. She sat next to Anurika on the bench, striking up a conversation. At first, Anurika hesitated, but Ijeoma's warmth was disarming, and before long, they were deep in conversation. Ijeoma had lived in Owerri for several years and had seen it all, the highs, the lows, the struggles, and the compromises people made to survive. Anurika hesitated, but then, in a moment of raw vulnerability, she shared her fears with Ijeoma. She spoke of her dreams to provide for her family and the crushing weight of failure that was slowly consuming her. Ijeoma listened intently, nodding sympathetically. Then, after a long pause, she leaned in closer. You know, darling, Ijeoma said softly, sometimes you have to do what you must to survive. It's not always pretty, but this world doesn't wait for you to be ready. If you need money, there are opportunities. Anurika looked at her, confusion and curiosity flickering in her eyes. I'm not talking about illegal things, no, Ijeoma continued quickly, seeing the wariness in Anurika's eyes. I'm not talking about anything illegal or dangerous, darling. There's a way for women like us to make money, especially if we know how to work the system. I'm talking about escorting. Anurika blinked, trying to process what Ijeoma had just said. The word hit her like a slap, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option left. You mean like going out with men for monies? Anurika asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it real. Ijeoma gave a small, knowing smile. Exactly. Men pay for companionship. Some are just lonely, others. Well, let's just say some want more than conversation. But it's easy money, Anurika. You'd be surprised how many women make a living this way. It's not forever. You do it until you get the money you need, and then you get out. Anurika's heart raced as the weight of Ijeoma's words settled heavily in her chest. Her mind raced, torn between the morals she had grown up with and the dire circumstances she found herself in. She had come to Owerri with dreams of a better life, but now she was faced with a choice that felt both repulsive and unavoidable. I don't know, Ijeoma, Anurika whispered, her voice trembling. I never imagined I would be doing something like this. It feels wrong. Ijeoma leaned closer, her eyes soft but insistent. I understand, my dear, but sometimes life doesn't give us a perfect path. We have to make the choices that get us ahead, even if we don't like them. Think about your family. What's the price of a better life for them? What's the price of your dreams? The words hit Anurika with such force that she felt dizzy. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, the hope, the expectation, the faith that Anurika would be the one to change their lives. Her younger siblings, too, depended on her. The weight of their dreams rested on her shoulders, and suddenly, every rejection, every empty job interview, felt like a betrayal. The desperation gnawed at her, urging her to make a decision, any decision, that might bring relief. I can't keep living like this, Anurika whispered, more to herself than to Ijeoma. I have nothing left. No one will give me a chance. She paused. I can't keep living like this, Anurika whispered, more to herself than to Ijeoma. I have nothing left. No one will give me a chance. She paused, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. Maybe this is the only way. Ijeoma placed a hand on Anurika's shoulder, her grip firm, as though offering both reassurance and warning. It's a choice, Anurika. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, but you should know that sometimes survival comes with a price. The world isn't always kind, and there's no shame in doing what you need to survive. You can take control of your circumstances, and this could be your way out. Anurika sat still, the words echoing in her mind. She thought about her mother's hope, the life she had left behind in the village, and the growing sense of powerlessness that seemed to consume her. The idea of selling her body felt alien and horrifying, yet the promise of financial stability and the chance to change her family's life weighed heavily in her heart. I'll think about it, Anurika finally said, her voice distant, as though she were trying to convince herself more than Ijeoma. Ijeoma smiled knowingly, offering her a card with a number scribbled on it. When you're ready, call me. I'll help you get started. She stood up, brushing off her clothes, and looked down at Anurika. Don't waste time thinking too long, though. Time doesn't wait for anyone, especially in a city like this. That night, Anurika lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tiny, rented room she called home. Her thoughts whirled in a spiral of confusion, guilt, and the overwhelming need to act. She couldn't sleep, and with every passing hour, the weight of her decision grew heavier. Her stomach churned as she tried to reconcile the woman she had hoped to become with the choices that now seemed unavoidable. In the silence of the night, she thought about Ijioma's words. Sometimes survival comes with a price star. Was this truly her only way out? The 5,000 naira she had left in her wallet was nowhere near enough to pay rent for the next month, let alone take care of her family. And if she didn't act fast, she would be back in the village with nothing to show for her time in the city, a failure in the eyes of everyone who had sent their hopes along with her. The next morning, after a restless night, Anurika found herself reaching for the card Ijeoma had given her. Her hands shook as she dialed the number. She didn't know what she expected, but when a voice on the other end answered, her heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" The voice asked, a smooth, unbothered tone that sounded detached from the heaviness of the situation. Anurika hesitated, swallowing hard. I'm ready to talk. Within days, Anurika met with the man Ijeoma had introduced her to. His name was Mr. Edu, and he was a regular client in the world of escorting that Ijeoma had described. He was older, dressed impeccably, and his charm was intoxicating. He carried an air of wealth and power, his demeanor calm and measured, as though everything in his life was carefully curated. Anurika met him at a posh restaurant in the city. The setting was starkly different from the poverty-stricken areas she had come from. The soft glow of chandeliers illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floors. Mr. Edu's presence was commanding, yet he seemed to make her feel both nervous and strangely at ease. As they sat at the table, sipping wine, Mr. Edu wasted no time. His eyes were sharp, analyzing her as he spoke with calculated calmness. "I'm sure you understand the arrangement, Anurika," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with authority. "What you'll be doing is not out of the ordinary in our line of work. You'll be well compensated, and everything will be discreet. No one has to know, and you'll have the freedom to do as you wish with your earnings." Anurika nodded, her heart racing. She had heard rumors of men like him, wealthy, powerful, who could have whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. She had convinced herself that she could handle it, that she could separate herself from the emotional aspects of the transaction. But deep inside, she knew it was a lie. "I understand," Anurika whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Edu leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Good. But I have one condition that might be unconventional." Anurika's stomach tightened. Her eyes darted to his face, trying to gauge whether this was part of a game or something far more sinister. "You see," he continued, his tone casual but his gaze sharp, "I have a rather peculiar interest. Something that might not be to every woman's liking. But you, I believe, are different. It's a simple request, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for it." Anurika felt a chill run through her as he spoke. The air between them seemed to thicken, his words carrying an unsettling weight. She had expected a transaction, but nothing like this. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. Mr. Edu smiled, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "I'm offering you 5 million naira, he said, his voice steady, "for one night. A very unique night where you would be required to engage with my dog. 5 million naira, Anurika. Just for one act." The words hung in the air, each syllable sinking deeper into her consciousness. Anurika froze, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Her thoughts scrambled, unable to form a coherent response. I don't understand," she stammered, her heart pounding. "You want me to what?" Mr. Edu's smile never wavered, but his eyes were unwaveringly serious. It's a simple request. Just one act, and the money is yours. No one has to know. It's between us. And with 5 million naira, your life would change overnight. Anurika's mind raced. The amount of money he was offering was beyond anything she could ever dream of. She could pay off her debts, send money back home to her family, and never worry about where her next meal would come from. It was more than enough to secure a future for herself and her loved ones, a future she had been striving for since she first set foot in the city. But as the words sank deeper into her mind, a wave of disgust and disbelief washed over her. The proposition was grotesque, vile even. She had heard whispers of such depravity, but never had she imagined she would be asked to participate in it herself. 5 million, Anurika repeated numbly, her voice shaky.
But why?
Why would you want that from me? Mr. Edu's expression softened, though his eyes remained calculating. It's not about you, Anurika, he said, his tone almost soothing. It's about the power I hold. And for me, it's an act of control. Something you'll never understand until you experience it. But I'm offering you a choice. You can walk away from this, or you can take the money and change your life. I'm giving you the opportunity to escape this life of struggle. Think of your family, your future. Anurika's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to refuse, to stand up and leave the table, to never look back. But the temptation, the sheer enormity of the money, pulled at her. The weight of her family's expectations, of her mother's faith, clung to her like a suffocating blanket. Tears welled in her eyes, and she fought to control them. How had she come to this point? Her mind raced, torn between the life she had dreamed of and the dark, horrifying path before her. The thought of walking away from the table, of rejecting the offer, seemed almost impossible. The money was a lifeline, an escape from the crushing weight of failure that had been following her for weeks. But deep down, something inside her recoiled at the thought of what he was asking. It wasn't just the physical act, it was the violation of her own dignity, the erosion of everything she had once believed about herself. Yet, the promise of 5 million naira, enough to secure her future, her family's future, was a temptation she couldn't shake. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't. I don't know what kind of person I would be if I did this. How could I live with myself? Mr. Edu's gaze never left her, his expression unreadable. He was patient, calm, almost as though he had anticipated her reaction. I understand, Anurika, he said softly. I'm not here to force you into anything. This is your choice. But think about it carefully. In this world, survival requires sacrifices. And the money, that kind of money, doesn't come easily. It never will. The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension. Anurika's hands clenched into fists on the table, and for a moment, she thought she might crumble. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, as she grappled with the enormity of the decision before her. Every part of her screamed to walk away, to refuse him, but the weight of the world on her shoulders, the desperation for her family, the fear of failure, the promise of a future, held her in place. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to endure, but here, at this moment, she felt so small, so helpless. How had it come to this? The money seemed like the only solution to everything that was wrong in her life, but the cost, the price she would have to pay to get it, was something she wasn't sure she could live with. I need time to think, Anurika said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes avoiding his. Mr. Edu's gaze softened just slightly, as though he respected her hesitation. Of course, he replied. Take all the time you need. But remember, time is something you don't have in abundance. Opportunities like this don't come often, Anurika. You can't afford to waste it. The words echoed in her mind as she left the restaurant, the offer still hanging in the air like a cloud of impending storm. Anurika's feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her away from the restaurant and into the chaotic streets of Owerri, but her mind remained trapped in that moment. She walked aimlessly, her thoughts consumed by Mr. Edu's words, the unimaginable sum of money, and the dark choice she was now faced with. As the evening sun dipped behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the streets, Anurika found herself standing by the side of a busy road. She leaned against a lamppost, her mind a whirlwind of fear, shame, and overwhelming temptation. She had come to Owerri with a singular purpose, to change her life and her family's circumstances, but had she now found herself trapped by a different kind of desperation? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from her mother, a simple, "How are you, my child? Have you found work?" Anurika stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of her mother's unwavering trust and love nearly crushing her. Tears sprang to her eyes as she typed a quick response. "I'm fine, Mama. I'm still looking for something. I'll be okay." But in her heart, Anurika knew she was lying. The truth was that she was far from okay. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the only way forward seemed to lead her down a dark and twisted path. That night, after returning to her small, dimly lit room, Anurika sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to process everything that had happened. The sound of the bustling city outside filtered through the thin walls, a constant reminder of the life that she had come to chase. But now, it felt more like a maze, twisted and endless, full of choices that seemed impossible to escape. She couldn't stop thinking about her mother's message, about the weight of her family's hopes resting on her shoulders. And yet, the very idea of taking Mr. Edu's offer, of giving up a piece of herself to secure that future, was tearing her apart. Anurika closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and in that moment, something inside her clicked. She had come to Owerri to find a better life, not one built on shame, but one that she could stand behind with pride. The money, the promises, the temptations, they weren't the answer. The world might push her toward difficult choices, but she didn't have to sacrifice her soul to survive. She stood up from the bed, wiping away the tears that had silently fallen down her face. No amount of money could replace the respect she had for herself, the strength she had built to survive on her own terms. She could find another way. It might not be easy, and it might take longer than she had hoped, but there had to be a way that didn't cost her dignity. Anurika reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, her fingers hovering over names. She needed advice. She needed someone who would understand without judgment. Her thoughts landed on Ijeoma, someone who had seen the harsh realities of the city, but also knew the tricks to survive. She had trusted Ijeoma enough to listen, but now she had to confront her with the decision she had made and the decision she was about to reject. Taking a deep breath, Anurika sent a message. "I've decided I don't want to go through with it. I can't. I'll find another way. But I need your help, Ijeoma. I don't know where else to turn." She stared at the screen, waiting for a response. As she waited, she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a first step toward taking back control of her life. The city, as overwhelming as it was, didn't have to define her. She could build her own path, even if it meant starting from scratch. Minutes later, Ijeoma's reply came through. "I understand, Anurika. I'll help you. It's not going to be easy, but you don't have to do this alone." The message was simple, but it was enough. For the first time since she had arrived in Owerri, Anurika felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was still a way out of this maze, a way forward that didn't require her to compromise who she was. She stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Anurika felt a quiet resolve. As the night wore on, Anurika sat by the window, staring out at the lights of the city. The decision she had made, rejecting Mr. EDU's offer, felt like a small victory. But it also left her with a deep sense of uncertainty. She had no clear plan, no guaranteed way out. The road ahead was foggy, and she was alone, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of empowerment. The next morning, Ijeoma called her, her voice warm yet firm. "Anurika, I'm glad you made that choice. Now, we need to focus on getting you something real. I know people. We can't guarantee anything, but I can help you get started." Anurika felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had trusted Ijeoma once, and now she was trusting her again, but this time, it felt different. Ijeoma wasn't offering shortcuts or promises of easy money. She was offering a chance to build something from the ground up, something that could give Anurika real security. "I'm ready," Anurika said, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ijeoma gave a reassuring laugh. "I know you will. But remember, this isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, and you'll have to fight for it. But I believe in you, Anurika. You're stronger than you think." With Ijeoma's words echoing in her mind, Anurika felt a renewed sense of determination. She had always prided herself on her resilience, and now it was time to put that to the test. She wasn't going to let her circumstances define her. This was a new beginning, a chance to forge a path that was truly her own. Over the next few weeks, Ijeoma introduced Anurika to people in various industries, places where she could start from the bottom and work her way up. There were no shortcuts, no immediate solutions, but with each small step, Anurika began to see a way forward. She worked long hours at a cafe, taking on extra shifts whenever she could, her tired muscles a reminder of the sacrifices she was making. At night, she studied, learning new skills and improving her knowledge of the city and its opportunities. Her life wasn't glamorous, and there were still moments of doubt and fear, but with every passing day, Anurika felt stronger. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt in control. The weight of her family's expectations no longer suffocated her, because now she was building something real, something that belonged to her. One evening, as she closed up the cafe after a long shift, Ijeoma called with some news. "I've got a lead for you," she said, her voice excited. "It's not much, but it's a step. A friend of mine is looking for a personal assistant. They're offering a salary that's far better than anything you've been making so far. It's a long shot, but I think you could be a good fit. Are you ready to take the next step?" Anurika's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for, an actual chance to move forward. Her hands gripped the phone tighter as she processed the news. Yes, I'm ready," she replied without hesitation, her voice filled with renewed hope. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ijeoma gave a soft chuckle. "That's what I like to hear. I'll set up the interview for tomorrow. Dress your best, Anurika. This is your chance." The next morning, Anurika stood in front of a mirror, adjusting her outfit, simple but neat, a far cry from the ragged clothes she had arrived in months ago. She looked at her reflection, seeing a woman who had been through pain, fear, and uncertainty, but who had fought her way through it. A woman who was determined to build a future. She took a deep breath, wiped away the nervousness, and headed out the door. The city seemed different today, brighter, as if it, too, was anticipating the shift in her life. As Anurika made her way to the interview, her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. She had no idea what to expect, but for the first time, she felt like she was taking control of her future. The office was sleek and modern, a sharp contrast to the humble places she had worked in so far. The receptionist greeted her with a warm smile and ushered her into a waiting area where she could already see a few other candidates, each dressed more formally than her, their faces full of determination. Anurika's nerves crept back, but she reminded herself that she belonged here just as much as they did. Minutes later, she was called into the interview room. The hiring manager, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of authority, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Anurika, is it? Please, take a seat." As they sat across from one another, the woman began asking the typical interview questions. Anurika answered them all with confidence, drawing on the skills she had learned while working at the cafe and the knowledge she had gained from late-night study sessions. She emphasized her work ethic, her willingness to learn, and her dedication to making the most of every opportunity. As the interview progressed, Anurika found herself settling into a rhythm, her nervousness fading with each question answered. The hiring manager, Mrs. Okoye, listened intently, her piercing eyes never leaving Anurika's face, as if she were assessing more than just her qualifications. "Tell me, Anurika," Mrs. Okoye asked, her voice smooth and professional, "why do you want this position?" Anurika paused, carefully considering the question. She had rehearsed answers to every other possible question, but this one felt different. This was the moment where she had to truly express her motivations, the reason she was sitting in front of this woman, hoping for a chance to change her life. "I want this position because I'm ready for more," Anurika said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I've been working hard, trying to make ends meet, but I know I can do more than just survive. I want to prove to myself that I can succeed."